In the harsh winter of 1867 Montana Territory, mountain man Ezra Blackwood paid 30 silver coins for a pregnant girl sold by her desperate mother, thinking he was saving a stranger from a cruel fate. But when the child was born with eyes, the exact shade of mountain pine, the same rare green as Ezra's own, he realized the impossible truth about the son he never knew he had fathered. What happens when a man discovers that salvation and destiny can arrive in the same unexpected moment? The crack of gunfire echoed through the Montana Territory mountains like thunder, but Ezra Blackwood didn't flinch as the bullet whizzed past his ear. Snow exploded from the pine tree behind him, and he rolled behind a fallen log, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Should have minded your own business, Blackwood," shouted Jake Morrison from somewhere up the rocky slope. "That beaver dam belongs to the Morrison clan now." Ezra spat into the snow and checked his rifle. 3 bullets left. Jake had brought his 2 brothers, which meant 3 against 1 in terrain that favored whoever held the high ground. The winter of 1867 had been brutal enough without the Morrison family trying to steal trapping grounds that Ezra's father had worked 30 years before. The mountains stretched endless and white in every direction, peaks cutting the gray sky like broken teeth. Wind howled through the valleys with a voice that sounded almost human, carrying the promise of another blizzard before nightfall. Ezra had been checking his trap lines when the Morrisons ambushed him, but now survival mattered more than catching beaver. A shadow moved between the trees above. Ezra aimed carefully and squeezed the trigger. The shadow yelped and disappeared, followed by angry shouting from the other brothers. Blood on snow meant one of them was hurt, but not badly enough to retreat. "You can't hold that spot forever," Jake called. "We got all day, and you got nowhere to run." Ezra knew Jake was right. His cabin lay 15 miles southeast, and darkness came early in winter. Getting caught on the mountain at night meant freezing to death, assuming the Morrisons didn't kill him first. His fingers were already numb inside his thick gloves, and ice formed in his beard with each breath. But Ezra Blackwood hadn't survived 20 years in the wilderness by giving up when things looked bad. He'd buried his wife Martha just last spring, along with the baby she'd been carrying. The grief had nearly broken him, but these mountains had taught him that breaking and dying were different things entirely. He studied the slope above, noting where the snow looked deeper and where the rocks jutted out like stepping stones. The Morrisons were city boys originally, more comfortable in saloons than snowdrifts. They knew how to shoot, but they didn't understand mountain weather the way someone born to it did. The wind was shifting, bringing the scent of heavy snow. Another hour, maybe 2, and visibility would drop to nothing. If Ezra could stay alive that long, he might slip away in the storm. But first, he needed to even the odds. Moving carefully, Ezra worked his way along the fallen log toward a cluster of boulders. Snow crunched under his boots despite his efforts to stay quiet. A rifle cracked, and bark exploded from a tree inches from his head. He dove forward, sliding on his belly across the icy ground until he reached cover. "Getting desperate, ain't you?" laughed one of Jake's brothers. "Shoulda just walked away when you had the chance." From his new position, Ezra could see movement through the trees. The Morrisons were working their way down the slope, thinking they had him trapped. They probably did, but mountain men learned early that trapped animals fought the hardest. Ezra lined up his shot and waited. Patience was everything in hunting, whether the prey walked on 4 legs or 2. His father had taught him that, back when this whole territory seemed full of promise instead of threats. Now most of the old-timers were dead or gone, leaving the mountains to men who saw only profit where others had seen home. A figure in a dark coat moved between 2 pine trees. Ezra held his breath and pulled the trigger. The man stumbled and fell, clutching his shoulder. Not a killing shot, but enough to make the others more careful. "Tommy's hit." Jake's voice carried a note of worry now. "Tommy, can you hear me?" "I'm all right," came the reply, but it sounded strained. "Shoulder's bleeding pretty good, though." 2 bullets left. Ezra checked the sky and saw the clouds growing darker. The storm would hit soon, bringing the kind of wind and snow that made travel impossible. If he could hold his position until then, he might survive this day after all. But staying meant another night alone on the mountain. Another night remembering Martha's laugh and the way she'd placed his hand on her belly to feel the baby move. Some mornings, Ezra woke up and forgot for just a moment that they were gone. Then reality would crash over him like an avalanche, leaving him gasping and empty. Maybe it would be easier to just stand up and let the Morrisons finish what they'd started. At least then the loneliness would end. The thought had barely formed when something shifted in the wind. Not the smell of snow this time, but something else. Smoke. Wood smoke, but not from any fireplace. Someone was burning green wood, the kind of fire that produced more smoke than heat. A signal fire, maybe, or just poor woodcraft. Either way, it meant other people were nearby. Ezra had assumed these mountains were empty, except for him and the Morrisons, but apparently he was wrong. The smoke came from the south, toward Bitter Creek settlement. Maybe someone was hunting, or maybe travelers had gotten lost in the weather. "You smell that?" Jake's voice drifted down from above. "Smoke," Tommy replied. "Someone's got a fire going down valley." "Might be more of Blackwood's friends," said the third brother. "We should finish this quick and get moving." Ezra grinned despite his situation. The Morrisons were getting nervous, and nervous men made mistakes. He shifted position again, moving toward the smoke. If there were other people down there, they might be willing to help, or they might side with whoever offered the most money. In the territories, you never knew which way strangers would jump. Snow began falling in earnest now, fat flakes that stuck to everything and made the world look like the inside of a snow globe. Visibility dropped quickly, and the wind picked up until it howled like a living thing. Perfect weather for disappearing, if a man knew how to use it. Ezra started moving south, staying low and using every bit of cover. Behind him, the Morrisons shouted to each other, trying to coordinate in the growing storm. Their city voices sounded small and lost against the mountain's roar. The smoke grew stronger as he worked his way down the valley. Someone was definitely camped nearby, though whether they were friend or foe remained to be seen. In country this remote, you prepared for the worst and hoped for something better. As the snow thickened around him like a white curtain, Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that this day was about to change his life in ways he couldn't imagine. The mountains had a way of putting you exactly where you needed to be, even when you thought you were just running from trouble. The settlement of Bitter Creek looked like the end of the world in the swirling snow, a handful of wooden buildings huddled together like scared animals. Ezra approached carefully, his rifle ready, and his eyes scanning for any sign of the Morrison brothers. The storm had covered his tracks, but it had also hidden theirs. Warm light spilled from Murphy's trading post, and voices carried on the wind. Not the rough laughter of trappers and miners, but something sharper. An argument maybe, or worse. Ezra had hoped to find supplies and information, but trouble seemed to follow him like a shadow these days. He tied his horse to the hitching post and pushed through the heavy wooden door. Heat hit his face like a physical thing, and he blinked as his eyes adjusted to the lamplight. The smell of tobacco and unwashed bodies filled the air, mixed with something else. Fear, maybe, or desperation. "Please," a woman's voice cracked like breaking ice. "She's all I have left." Ezra's gaze found the source of the words, and felt his stomach clench. A thin woman in a patched dress stood before Murphy's scarred wooden counter, her hands shaking as she clutched a few crumpled bills. Beside her stood a girl who couldn't be more than 16, her dark eyes wide with terror. But it was what Ezra saw in the girl's posture that made his blood run cold. She stood with one hand pressed protectively against her belly, and even through her loose shawl, the curve was unmistakable. She was carrying a child, and from the look of things, not by choice. "Ain't my problem your husband ran off," Murphy said, not looking up from the ledger he was writing in. "Debt's still debt, and you ain't got the money." "But she can work," the woman pressed, her voice getting higher and more desperate. "She's strong, and she knows how to cook and clean, and when the baby comes—" "Nobody wants to buy a girl with a baby," Murphy replied flatly. "Babies eat food and make noise. Bad for business." The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. They were talking about selling the girl like she was livestock, and she was pregnant. His mind went immediately to Martha, to the way she'd looked when she'd told him about their baby. joy and fear mixed together, hope and terror walking hand in hand. But where Martha had been surrounded by love and protection, this girl had nothing. Her own mother was trying to sell her to pay debts, and the men in the trading post looked at her like she was meat to be weighed and priced. "I'll take her." The words left Ezra's mouth before he'd made a conscious decision to speak. Every head in the room turned toward him, including the girls. Her eyes met his across the smoky room, and he saw something there that reminded him of a deer caught in torchlight, beautiful and terrified, ready to run but with nowhere to go. "Well now," Murphy said, his tone changing like oil on water. "Ezra Blackwood, heard the Morrison boys were hunting you up mountain." "The Morrison boys ran into some weather trouble," Ezra replied, not taking his eyes off the girl. "How much?" The woman who was trying to sell her own daughter straightened up like a snake sensing prey. $50, she said quickly. "She's young and strong, and the baby." She gestured vaguely at the girl's belly. "Well, some men like that sort of thing." The suggestion in her words made Ezra's hands clench into fists. He'd seen enough of the world to know what she was implying, and it made him sick, but he kept his voice level when he spoke. $30, he said, "and that's for her freedom, not her service. The baby doesn't belong to you to sell." "Now hold on," the woman protested. "50's a fair price for 30. Ezra's voice carried the kind of authority that came from 20 years of surviving in places where weakness meant death. "Take it, or find another buyer." He pulled the coins from his pocket and set them on the counter one by one. Each clink of silver against wood sounded like a nail being driven into a coffin, but he wasn't sure whose funeral it was for. His old life, maybe, or the girl's life, as someone's property. The girl watched the transaction with eyes that seemed too old for her face. She'd learned early that adults made decisions about her life without asking her opinion, but something in Ezra's manner was different. When he looked at her, he didn't see merchandise. He saw a person who deserved better than this. "What's your name?" he asked her directly, ignoring the adults who thought they owned her. "Elena," she whispered, her accent adding music to the simple word. "Elena Vasquez." "I'm Ezra Blackwood," he replied, as if they were being introduced at a church social instead of a slave auction. "Do you want to come with me?" The question surprised everyone in the room, including Elena. Adults didn't usually ask children what they wanted, especially not girls who'd been sold to pay their family's debts. But Ezra waited for her answer, like it mattered, like she had the right to choose her own fate. "Yes," she said, so quietly he had to lean forward to hear her. "Please." The word please broke something in Ezra's chest that had been frozen since Martha died. This girl was asking him to save her, and maybe in saving her, he could find some purpose in his empty life. The mountains had taught him that everything happened for a reason, even when that reason wasn't clear at first. Murphy counted the coins and nodded to the woman. 30 it is. Papers are in order, and the debt's paid." "Papers?" Ezra asked. "Indenture contract," Murphy explained. "Makes it all legal and proper. She works for you for 7 years to pay off what her family owed, plus room and board. Tear them up." Murphy blinked. "What?" "The papers. Tear them up. She's not working for me, and she's not paying anyone's debt. She's free to leave whenever she wants." The silence in the room was so complete that Ezra could hear snow hitting the windows like tiny fists. Nobody bought people just to set them free, especially not in the territories where life was cheap and freedom was something you fought for. Elena stared at him with an expression he couldn't read. Maybe she thought it was a trick, or maybe she'd never met someone who believed freedom couldn't be bought and sold like corn or cattle. Either way, she gathered her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders and took a step toward him. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she said simply. "I've got a cabin up mountain," Ezra replied. "It's warm and there's plenty of food. You can stay as long as you need to figure out what comes next." As they prepared to leave the trading post, Ezra caught Murphy watching them with calculating eyes. News traveled fast in small settlements, and by morning everyone would know that the mountain man had bought a pregnant girl and then declared her free. Some would think he was soft in the head. Others would assume darker motives. But as Elena walked beside him into the swirling snow, trusting a stranger because she had no other choice, Ezra realized that other people's opinions mattered less than doing what was right. The mountains had taken everything he'd ever loved, but maybe they were about to give him something back. The storm was getting worse, and the journey to his cabin would be dangerous in the dark, but Elena kept pace without complaining, even when the wind tried to knock her sideways. There was strength in her that hadn't been broken by whatever had brought her to Murphy's trading post, and Ezra found himself hoping she'd find reasons to stay once they reached safety. Behind them, the lights of Bitter Creek disappeared into the white darkness, and ahead lay only the unknown path through the mountains toward whatever future they would build together. The howling wind nearly tore Elena off her feet as they climbed the mountain path, but she gritted her teeth and pushed forward through snow that reached her knees. Behind her, Ezra's steady footsteps provided the only comfort in a world that had turned completely white and wild. "How much farther?" Elena shouted over the storm, one hand pressed against her belly, where the baby seemed to be dancing with worry. "Half-mile," Ezra called back, though his voice sounded strained. "Stay close to the trees." The forest around them groaned and creaked like an old ship in rough seas. Snow fell so thick that Elena couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, and every step felt like walking into a wall of ice. Her thin shoes were soaked through, and her feet had gone numb an hour ago. But she didn't complain. Complaining was what weak people did, and Elena had learned long ago that weakness got you sold to strangers in trading posts. Instead, she focused on putting one foot in front of the other, following the dark shape of Ezra's coat through the blizzard. When they finally reached the cabin, Elena almost cried with relief. It stood solid and welcoming among the pine trees, with windows that glowed yellow in the darkness. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, and the sight of it made her believe that maybe everything would be all right after all. Ezra pushed open the heavy wooden door and gestured for her to go first. "Welcome home," he said simply, as if she wasn't a stranger he'd bought from her desperate mother just hours before. The warmth inside hit Elena like a gentle slap, making her skin tingle as feeling returned to her frozen fingers. The cabin was bigger than it had looked from outside, with solid log walls and a stone fireplace that filled the room with dancing light. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books and tools and other signs of a life lived alone but not abandoned. "Sit by the fire," Ezra said, hanging his coat on a wooden peg. "I'll get you some dry clothes and hot food." Elena sank into a chair near the fireplace, hardly believing she was safe and warm after so many months of uncertainty. The baby shifted in her belly, as if it too could sense that they'd found shelter from the storm. She placed both hands over the curve and whispered a prayer of thanks in Spanish. Ezra returned with a wool blanket and a cup of steaming broth that smelled like heaven. "This was my wife's," he said, offering her the blanket. "She would have wanted you to have it." "Was?" Elena asked softly, noting the past tense in his words. "She died last spring," Ezra replied, his voice getting quiet. "Her and the baby she was carrying. Sickness took them both." Elena looked around the cabin with new eyes, seeing the small touches that spoke of a woman's presence. A cushion on the rocking chair, herbs hanging from the rafters, curtains at the windows made from cheerful yellow fabric. Martha Blackwood had made this place a home, and now it felt empty despite Ezra's best efforts. "I'm sorry," Elena said, meaning it completely. She knew what it felt like to lose people you loved, to wake up each morning and remember all over again that they were gone. "Winter's the hardest time," Ezra admitted, settling into the chair across from her. "Everything's quiet and still, and you start hearing ghosts in every shadow." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside and the fire crackle in the hearth. Elena sipped her broth and felt strength returning to her body, but her mind was full of questions she wasn't sure how to ask. "Why did you help me?" she finally said. "You don't know anything about me." Ezra stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "Because everyone deserves a chance to choose their own path. And because—" he paused, then looked directly at her. "Because I couldn't save my own family, but maybe I could save someone else's." Elena felt tears spring to her eyes at the raw honesty in his words. This man had lost everything, and yet he'd spent his last $30 to buy a stranger's freedom. It was the kind of kindness she'd almost forgotten existed in the world. "The baby's father," she began, then stopped, not sure how much to reveal. "You don't owe me explanations," Ezra said gently. "What matters is that you're both safe now." But Elena found herself wanting to tell him anyway. He was a soldier passing through town. He said he loved me, promised to come back after his assignment. That was 8 months ago. She touched her belly again. "I haven't heard from him since." Ezra nodded without judgment. He'd seen enough of life to know that promises were easier to make than keep, especially when it came to young men and younger women. "What about your father? You said your name was Vasquez." "Papa died 2 years ago in a mining accident. Left us with debts we couldn't pay." Elena's voice hardened with old anger. "Mama started drinking and gambling, trying to win enough to clear our name. Instead, she just made everything worse." The pieces of Elena's story fell into place like stones in Ezra's mind. A girl left vulnerable by her father's death, betrayed by a man who should have protected her, finally sold by a mother who had lost her way. It was an old story in the territories, where women had few choices and fewer protections. "What will happen to her?" Elena asked. "To Mama, I mean." "Don't know," Ezra replied honestly. "But that's not your responsibility anymore. You've got your own future to think about now." Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken. The wind no longer howled with the same fury, and the snow fell more gently against the windows. Elena watched the flakes drift past the glass and wondered what tomorrow would bring. "I can cook and clean," she said suddenly, "and I know how to tend gardens and preserve food. I won't be useless while I'm here." "You're not here to work," Ezra reminded her. "You're here because you need a safe place to have your baby and figure out what comes next." Elena studied his weathered face in the firelight, looking for hidden motives or unspoken expectations. But all she saw was genuine kindness, the rare sort that expected nothing in return. It scared her almost as much as it comforted her, because she'd learned not to trust things that seemed too good to be true. "What if I want to stay?" she asked quietly. "After the baby comes, I mean. What if I don't want to leave?" Ezra was quiet for so long that Elena wondered if she'd said something wrong. Finally, he spoke, his words careful and measured. "These mountains can be lonely," he said, "and they can be dangerous for people who don't understand their ways. But they can also be home if you're willing to learn and adapt." It wasn't exactly an answer, but it wasn't a rejection either. Elena wrapped the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders and decided that maybe not knowing everything about the future was all right. For now, it was enough to be warm and safe and free to make her own choices. As the fire burned lower and the storm finally began to die outside, Elena felt sleep pulling at her eyelids. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, but tonight she could rest without fear. For the first time in months, she was exactly where she wanted to be. The scream that tore through the morning air sent every bird in the forest flying, and Ezra dropped his axe as he recognized the sound of pure terror coming from inside his cabin. Elena stood frozen by the kitchen window, pointing with a shaking finger at something outside. "There's a bear," she whispered, her face white as fresh snow. "A huge bear, and it's coming toward the house." Ezra grabbed his rifle from above the door and moved carefully to the window. Sure enough, a massive black bear was shambling across the clearing, probably drawn by the smell of the bacon Elena had been cooking for breakfast. The animal looked thin from winter hibernation, which made it dangerous and unpredictable. "Stay calm," Ezra said softly, checking his ammunition. "Bears usually run if you make enough noise, but this one looks hungry." Elena's hand moved protectively to her belly, which had grown noticeably larger during her 2 months at the cabin. The baby was due in late spring, and the last thing she needed was the stress of fighting off wild animals. The bear reached the porch steps and reared up on its hind legs, nearly as tall as the cabin's roof. It sniffed the air with interest, clearly following the scent of food. Then it dropped back down and began climbing the wooden steps with surprising grace for such a large creature. "What do we do?" Elena asked, backing away from the window. "Get behind the table," Ezra ordered, raising his rifle. "If this doesn't work, there's a root cellar under the kitchen floor. Hide there until it's safe." The bear reached the front door and began pawing at the wood, testing its strength. The heavy logs and iron hinges held firm, but the sound of claws scraping against timber made Elena's skin crawl with fear. Ezra moved to the door and pounded his fist against it from the inside. "Get out of here!" he shouted. "Go on! Get!" The bear paused its scratching but didn't retreat. Instead, it seemed to grow more interested, pressing its massive snout against the crack between the door and frame. Hot breath steamed in the cold air as it tried to catch more of the food smells from inside. "It's not working," Elena said, her voice tight with panic. "Why isn't it leaving?" Before Ezra could answer, they heard another sound that made both their hearts sink. More heavy footsteps in the snow, but these were different. Lighter, quicker, with a shuffling gait that meant only one thing. "Cubs," Ezra muttered. "She's got cubs with her." A mother bear with babies was 10 times more dangerous than a hungry bear looking for food. She would fight to the death to protect her young, and no amount of noise or threats would drive her away if she thought they posed a threat to her family. 2 small black shapes appeared at the edge of the clearing, tumbling through the snow like playful puppies. They couldn't be more than a few months old, and they followed their mother with complete trust that she would keep them safe from any danger. "We can't hurt her," Elena said suddenly, watching the cubs play in the morning sunshine. "She's just protecting her babies." Ezra looked at Elena with surprise. Most people's first instinct when facing a dangerous animal was to kill it before it killed them. But Elena's motherly instincts were already strong, even though her own baby hadn't been born yet. "Then we need to get creative," Ezra said, setting down his rifle. "Help me gather up all the food we can spare." Working quickly, they filled a cloth sack with bacon, dried meat, and some honey Ezra had been saving for special occasions. The bear continued scratching at the door, growing more agitated as time passed. Soon she might decide to try the windows or look for another way inside. "What's the plan?" Elena asked, tying the sack closed with shaking hands. "We're going to give her what she wants," Ezra replied. "Food for her and the cubs, far enough away from the cabin that she'll leave us alone." He moved to the back window, which looked out over the forest behind the cabin. The bear was still at the front door, which gave them a chance to slip the food outside without being seen. Carefully, Ezra opened the back window and dropped the sack into the snow about 20 feet from the cabin. The smell of meat and honey immediately began drifting on the morning breeze, and within minutes they heard the bear's attention shift. Heavy footsteps moved around the side of the cabin as the mother bear followed her nose toward the unexpected feast. Soon they could see her through the back window, tearing into the sack with obvious delight while her cubs romped nearby. "Will that be enough?" Elena asked, watching the family meal with a mixture of fear and fascination. "Should be," Ezra replied. "Bears are smart. She'll remember that this place means free food, not danger. As long as we don't threaten her cubs, she'll probably leave us alone." They watched from the safety of the cabin as the bear family finished their breakfast and wandered back into the forest. The cubs tumbled and played behind their mother, completely unaware of how close they'd all come to a deadly confrontation. When the bears were finally out of sight, Elena sank into a chair with relief. "I thought we were going to die," she admitted. "I was so scared for the baby." "Fear's normal," Ezra said, checking the door to make sure the bear hadn't damaged it. "But you kept your head and thought about what was best for everyone. That takes courage." Elena looked down at her hands, which were still trembling slightly. "I never thought I was brave. Growing up, I was always the one who needed protecting." "Bravery isn't about not being scared," Ezra explained. "It's about doing what's right even when you are scared. You showed real courage today." The compliment warmed Elena more than the fire in the hearth. For most of her life, people had told her what she couldn't do, what she wasn't strong enough for, what she should leave to men or older women. But Ezra saw strength in her that she was only beginning to recognize in herself. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, melting the snow from the cabin's roof in tiny waterfalls, Elena realized something had changed during their encounter with the bear. She no longer felt like a frightened girl who needed constant protection. Instead, she felt like someone who could face danger and find solutions. Someone who could protect what mattered most. The baby moved strongly in her belly, as if responding to her newfound confidence. Soon this little one would be born into a world full of dangers, from wild animals to harsh weather to people who might wish them harm. But Elena was beginning to believe that she could handle whatever challenges came their way. "Thank you," she said to Ezra, who was putting his rifle back above the door. "For what?" "For trusting me to help instead of just telling me to hide," Elena replied. "For treating me like someone who could solve problems instead of just creating them." Ezra paused in his work and looked at her with something that might have been pride. "You've got more strength than you know, Elena Vasquez. This baby of yours is lucky to have you for a mother." As they cleaned up the scattered breakfast dishes and prepared for another day in their mountain refuge, Elena felt a deep sense of belonging settling into her bones. This cabin, these mountains, this quiet life of facing each challenge as it came, it all felt more like home than anywhere she'd ever lived before. And if sometimes she caught Ezra watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something warmer and deeper than simple kindness, she told herself it was just gratitude for the company in his lonely wilderness home. The baby's first cry split the night like lightning, and Ezra's hand shook so badly he nearly dropped the clean towel he was holding. Elena lay exhausted on the bed, her hair soaked with sweat, but her eyes shone with a joy so bright it seemed to light up the entire cabin. "Is he healthy?" she gasped, trying to see the tiny bundle that Ezra was carefully cleaning. "Does he have all his fingers and toes?" "Perfect," Ezra whispered, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected. "He's absolutely perfect." The storm outside had been raging for 3 days, making it impossible to fetch the midwife from town. Ezra had delivered foals and calves before, but helping bring a human baby into the world was something entirely different. Every moment had been terrifying and wonderful at the same time. As he wrapped the newborn in Martha's softest blanket, Ezra found himself staring into tiny eyes that seemed far too wise for someone only minutes old. The baby had stopped crying and was looking around with curiosity, as if trying to understand this strange new world he'd entered. "What will you call him?" Ezra asked, placing the child gently in Elena's arms. "Miguel," she said without hesitation, "after my grandfather, who was the kindest man I ever knew." Ezra watched Elena cradle her son, and something twisted in his chest. The scene reminded him painfully of his dreams about Martha, about how she would have looked holding their child if things had been different. But instead of making him sad, seeing Elena's happiness filled him with a warmth he hadn't felt in over a year. "He has your eyes," Elena said softly, looking up at Ezra with a strange expression. "My eyes?" Ezra leaned closer to look at the baby, and his breath caught in his throat. Miguel's eyes weren't the dark brown he'd expected, but a pale green color that was uncommon in most families. Uncommon everywhere, actually, except when Ezra looked in a mirror. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He counted backwards in his mind, remembering the night 3 weeks after Elena had arrived when she'd been crying about her father's death. He'd held her while she sobbed, offering comfort that had somehow transformed into something deeper in the flickering firelight. They'd never spoken of it afterwards, both pretending it had been a moment of weakness brought on by loneliness and grief. But now, staring into Miguel's impossibly familiar eyes, Ezra understood that their moment of connection had created something far more significant than either of them had realized. "Elena," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "I know," she said simply. "I've known for months. I wasn't sure how to tell you." The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was sure how to cross. Outside, the storm continued its fury, but inside, the cabin felt suspended in time. Everything had changed in the space between one heartbeat and the next, and there was no going back to the way things were before. "Are you angry?" Elena asked, her voice small and uncertain. Ezra looked at Miguel, who had fallen asleep in his mother's arms with the complete trust that only babies possessed. This child was his son, not through purchase or charity, but through blood and bone and the mysterious ways that life sometimes surprised you when you least expected it. "No," he said finally, "not angry. Scared, maybe. Confused, but not angry." "I didn't plan it," Elena said quickly. "That night, when you comforted me. It just happened. I was so grateful to feel safe for the first time in months. And you were so kind and—" "You don't have to explain," Ezra interrupted gently. "I remember that night too. I remember thinking that holding you felt like the first right thing I'd done since Martha died." Elena's eyes filled with tears at his honesty. "When I realized I was carrying your child instead of that soldier's, I was terrified you'd think I'd tricked you somehow." Ezra reached out and touched Miguel's tiny hand, amazed when the baby's fingers immediately curled around his much larger finger. The grip was surprisingly strong, as if this little person was already determined to hold on to what mattered. "This changes everything," Ezra said, though he wasn't sure exactly how. "Does it have to?" Elena asked. "I mean, we've been living like a family for months already, taking care of each other, sharing meals, working together. The only difference is now we know Miguel belongs to both of us." She was right, Ezra realized. Somewhere along the way, without either of them planning it, they had become more than just a mountain man and the pregnant girl he'd helped. They'd become partners in the truest sense, sharing the daily work of survival and finding comfort in each other's company. But knowing Miguel was his son added layers of responsibility and emotion that Ezra wasn't sure he was ready for. What if he turned out to be a terrible father? What if he couldn't protect Elena and Miguel the way he'd failed to protect Martha and their unborn child? As if sensing his father's doubts, Miguel opened his eyes again and looked directly at Ezra with an expression that seemed to say, "Don't worry, we'll figure this out together." The simple trust in that gaze melted something frozen in Ezra's heart. This child was his second chance, his opportunity to build the family he'd thought he'd lost forever. And Elena was no longer just someone he was helping. She was the mother of his son, and maybe something even more important than that. "What happens now?" Elena asked, shifting Miguel to her shoulder where he settled with a contented sigh. "Now we learn how to be parents," Ezra replied, "and we figure out what kind of family we want to be." Outside, the storm began to weaken as dawn approached. The wind no longer howled with the same intensity, and the first pale light of morning crept through the cabin windows. It felt symbolic somehow, as if the weather itself was acknowledging that something new had been born into the world. Elena dozed fitfully as the sun rose higher, exhausted from the long labor. Ezra sat in the rocking chair nearby, holding Miguel and marveling at how such a tiny person could change everything so completely. The baby slept peacefully, unaware that his arrival had transformed two broken people into the beginning of something whole. As morning turned to afternoon and the storm finally passed, Ezra found himself making mental lists of everything that needed to be done. Baby clothes to make, a cradle to build, supplies to gather for the coming months. But underneath all the practical concerns was a deeper realization that both thrilled and terrified him. He was no longer just surviving in these mountains. For the first time since Martha's death, he had something worth living for. Two someones, actually, and he would do whatever it took to keep them safe and happy. When Elena woke from her nap, she found Ezra still holding Miguel, both of them bathed in afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. The sight made her heart full in a way she'd never experienced before. "Are you sorry?" she asked quietly. "About all of this, I mean. About me coming into your life and changing everything?" Ezra looked at her for a long moment, then at the sleeping baby in his arms. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute truth. "I thought my life was over when I lost Martha," he said. "I thought the best I could hope for was to survive each day until my time was up. But you and Miguel, you've given me something I never expected to have again: hope." The riders appeared on the horizon just as Elena was hanging Miguel's tiny clothes on the line to dry, and something about the way they moved made ice form in her stomach despite the warm spring sunshine. "Ezra," she called, scooping up the baby and hurrying toward the cabin. "Someone's coming, and they don't look friendly." Ezra emerged from the woodshed with an armload of logs, his eyes immediately finding the dust cloud that marked the approaching horses. 4 riders, moving with purpose across the valley floor. He'd been expecting trouble for weeks, ever since word had gotten around that the mountain man had a woman and baby living with him. "Get inside," he ordered. dropping the wood and reaching for his rifle. "Take Miguel to the root cellar and don't come out until I tell you it's safe." But as the riders drew closer, Elena's face went white with recognition. "It's her," she whispered. "It's my mother." The woman leading the group sat her horse like someone accustomed to being in charge, which was very different from the desperate creature who had tried to sell her daughter 6 months ago. The 3 men riding with her looked like hired guns, the kind of people who solved problems with violence first and asked questions later. Elena's mother had clearly used the $30 from selling Elena to improve her circumstances. Her dress was new and expensive. Her horse was well fed and properly saddled, and the confidence in her posture suggested that life had taken a turn for the better since her daughter had disappeared into the mountains. "Mrs. Vasquez," Ezra said carefully, as the riders stopped just outside rifle range, "this is unexpected. I've come for my daughter and grandchild," she announced, her voice carrying across the clearing with authority. "I know about the baby, Elena. I know it belongs to him." She pointed at Ezra with undisguised greed. Elena stepped protectively in front of Ezra. Miguel clutched against her chest. "You sold me, remember? I don't belong to you anymore." "That was business," her mother replied dismissively. "But blood is blood, and that child is my grandson. My flesh and blood. That makes him worth something." The cold calculation in her words made Ezra's trigger finger itch. This woman saw people as commodities to be bought and sold, and she'd clearly figured out that a mountain man's son might be worth more than just any baby. "How did you find out?" Elena demanded. "Murphy talks when he's drunk," one of the hired men said with a nasty grin. "Told everyone in 3 counties about the mountain man who bought a girl and got himself a son in the bargain." Elena felt sick at the thought of strangers discussing her private life like entertainment. The story had probably grown in the telling, becoming more scandalous with each retelling, until it bore little resemblance to the truth. "What do you want?" Ezra asked, though he was pretty sure he already knew the answer. "Compensation," Elena's mother said smoothly. "You got my daughter pregnant, which makes you responsible for supporting the child. I figure $500 ought to cover it." "500? Elena gasped. "That's more money than Papa made in 2 years. "Your papa was a fool who died poor," her mother snapped. "I'm not making the same mistake. This baby is my ticket to a better life, and you're going to help me collect." The 3 hired guns shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. They clearly expected Ezra to refuse, and they were prepared to use force to get what their employer wanted. But Ezra was studying the situation with the same careful attention he used when tracking dangerous animals. 4 against 1 wasn't good odds, especially with Elena and Miguel to protect. But these men were clearly more comfortable in saloons than wilderness, and they'd made the mistake of riding into his territory. "That's a lot of money," Ezra said slowly, as if considering the demand. "You can afford it," Elena's mother replied confidently. "Mountain men always have gold hidden away, and if you don't pay, well," she gestured toward her hired guns. "Accidents happen in the wilderness." Elena looked at Ezra with panic in her eyes. She'd found peace and safety in these mountains, had discovered what it felt like to be part of a real family. The thought of losing all of that to her mother's greed made her feel desperate and angry. "I won't let you take him," Elena said, surprising everyone including herself with the steel in her voice. "Miguel is my son, and this is my home. You have no right to either of them." Her mother's face twisted with ugly anger. "You ungrateful little fool. I gave you life, and I can take it away just as easily. You belong to me, girl, and so does that baby." "No," Elena said, stepping forward despite her fear. "I belonged to you once, but that ended the day you sold me like livestock. I'm not your property anymore, and neither is my son." The confrontation was building toward violence, and Ezra knew he had to act before someone got hurt. These mountains had taught him that sometimes the best defense was a good offense, and that thinking like prey got you eaten by predators. "You're right," he said suddenly, lowering his rifle slightly. "I do owe you compensation." Elena stared at him in shock, wondering if he was about to abandon her and Miguel to save his own skin. But something in Ezra's eyes told her to trust him, to wait and see what he had planned. "Smart man," Elena's mother said with satisfaction. I knew you'd see reason. The thing is, Ezra continued conversationally, I don't keep that kind of money here at the cabin. It's hidden in a cave about a mile up the mountain. Why don't you boys come with me to collect it, and we can settle this like civilized people? The hired guns looked at each other uncertainly. They'd been expecting a fight, not a reasonable negotiation, but the promise of easy money was too tempting to ignore. Leave one man here to watch the women, the leader decided. The rest of us will go with you to get the gold. It was exactly what Ezra had been hoping for. 3 men in unfamiliar territory, following him to a location he knew like the back of his hand. The odds had just gotten much better, and he had several ideas about how to even them further. As they prepared to leave, Ezra caught Elena's eye and mouthed the words, "Trust me." She nodded slightly, understanding that whatever he had planned, she needed to be ready to act when the moment came. The mountains had made Ezra Blackwood into a survivor, and now they were about to teach Elena's mother and her hired guns why threatening his family had been a very dangerous mistake. The gunshot echoed across the valley like thunder, and Elena's heart stopped as she watched 3 bodies tumble down the rocky slope where Ezra had led the hired men an hour before. Sounds like your mountain man just learned a hard lesson, sneered the guard who had stayed behind to watch her. His name was Pete, and he'd been getting bolder and nastier as the afternoon wore on, making comments about Elena that made her skin crawl. But Elena wasn't listening to Pete's crude remarks anymore. She was counting the figures that had fallen, and her blood ran cold when she realized there were only 3 of them. Either Ezra had survived the confrontation, or one of the hired guns was still alive up there. Miguel fussed in her arms, picking up on his mother's tension even though he was barely 2 months old. Elena bounced him gently, trying to keep him calm while her mind raced through possibilities. If Ezra was dead, she and Miguel were completely at the mercy of people who saw them as nothing more than valuable property. Stop your worrying, Pete said, moving closer to where Elena sat on the cabin steps. Boss lady's got big plans for you and that baby. Gonna make us all rich. What kind of plans? Elena asked, though she was afraid she already knew. Pete's grin was full of ugly promises. Rich men in the cities pay good money for young mothers and babies, especially pretty ones like you. And your mama, she's got connections with folks who arrange that kind of business. Elena's stomach turned with disgust and terror. Her mother wasn't just planning to extort money from Ezra. She was planning to sell Elena and Miguel to the highest bidder, probably to some wealthy man who collected people like other men collected horses or cattle. The sound of footsteps on the mountain path made both Elena and Pete look up sharply. A lone figure was making his way down through the pine trees, but the distance and shadows made it impossible to tell who it was. About time, Pete muttered, checking his pistol. Thought they might have gotten lost up there. Elena held her breath as the figure came closer. Please let it be Ezra, she prayed silently. Please let him be all right. Miguel needed his father, and she needed him too, in ways she was only beginning to understand. But as the man emerged from the tree line, Elena's heart sank. It wasn't Ezra at all, but one of the hired guns, the leader, whose name was Carson. His clothes were torn and bloody, and he limped badly as he approached the cabin. Where are the others? Pete called out. Dead, Carson replied grimly. The mountain man knew those trails better than we thought. Led us right into an ambush. Elena's mother, who had been sitting in the shade of a large pine tree, stood up with alarm. What about Blackwood? Please tell me he's dead too. Carson shook his head. Last I saw, he was very much alive and coming this way. We need to get out of here now. The news that Ezra was alive sent a surge of hope through Elena's chest, but it also meant the danger was far from over. If he was injured or outnumbered, he might not be able to reach them in time to prevent her mother from carrying out whatever plan she had. We're not leaving empty-handed, Elena's mother declared. Grab the girl and baby. We'll take them with us and sort out the details later. No! Elena jumped to her feet, clutching Miguel protectively. I'm not going anywhere with you. Pete reached for her arm, but Elena surprised him by swinging her free hand as hard as she could. Her fist connected with his nose in a satisfying crunch, and blood spurted down his face as he staggered backwards. "You little wildcat," he snarled, drawing his gun. "I'll teach you some manners." "You'll do no such thing," said a familiar voice from the edge of the clearing. Everyone turned to see Ezra step out of the forest, his rifle aimed directly at Pete's chest. His clothes were dirty, and there was a cut on his forehead, but he looked very much alive and extremely dangerous. "Drop your weapons," Ezra ordered calmly. "All of you." Carson's hand moved toward his gun, but stopped when he saw the unwavering steadiness of Ezra's aim. This wasn't some desperate farmer trying to protect his chickens. This was a man who had spent 20 years surviving in wilderness that killed weaker people. "You're outnumbered," Elena's mother said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Ezra asked mildly. "Pete's got a broken nose, and Carson can barely stand. You're a middle-aged woman with soft hands who's never fired a gun in anger. I'd say the odds are about even." Elena felt a fierce pride in how calm and controlled Ezra sounded, even in the face of multiple enemies. This was the man who had risked everything to save her, who had given her a home and helped bring her son into the world. This was the father Miguel deserved. "What do you want?" Carson asked, still debating whether to go for his gun. "I want you to leave," Ezra replied simply. "All of you, right now, and I want you to never come back to my mountain." "This isn't over," Elena's mother hissed. "That's my daughter and my grandson, and I have rights." "Your rights ended when you sold Elena like a piece of property," Ezra said, his voice getting harder. "You want to claim family now? Where were you when she needed food and shelter? Where were you when she was scared and alone?" Elena watched her mother's face cycle through anger, frustration, and finally, a calculating coldness that was somehow worse than rage. "Fine," she said eventually, "but this won't be the last you see of me. There are laws, even in this God-forsaken territory, courts that will side with a grandmother over a man who bought his wife." The threat hung in the air like smoke as the three unwelcome visitors gathered their belongings and prepared to leave. Elena knew her mother wasn't the type to give up easily, especially when she thought there was money to be made. As they mounted their horses, Carson looked back at Ezra with professional respect. "You fight dirty, mountain man. I'll give you that." "I fight to win," Ezra corrected. "There's a difference." They watched until the riders disappeared over the ridge, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation had been more of a beginning than an ending. Her mother had tasted the possibility of profit, and that kind of hunger didn't die easily. "Are you hurt?" Elena asked, noticing how carefully Ezra was moving. "Nothing that won't heal," he replied, setting down his rifle and flexing his shoulders. "What about you? Did they hurt you or Miguel?" "Just scared us," Elena admitted. "But Ezra, what she said about courts and laws, could she really take Miguel away from us?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment, staring off toward the mountains where his enemies had disappeared. When he finally spoke, his words were heavy with the weight of hard truths. "In the territories, law is whatever the man with the most money says it is," he said, "and your mother seemed to have found herself some financing." Elena felt cold despite the warm afternoon sun. She'd thought the worst was behind them when she'd escaped her mother's control, but apparently freedom was something you had to keep fighting for, over and over again. "What do we do?" she asked. Ezra looked at her and Miguel, his family now in every way that mattered, and Elena saw something shift in his expression, a hardening, a determination that spoke of decisions made and lines drawn in the sand. "We get ready," he said simply, "because she'll be back, and next time she'll bring more than just hired guns." The letter arrived on a crisp October morning, carried by a nervous-looking government clerk who clearly wished he was anywhere else, but on a dangerous mountain, delivering bad news to a man with a reputation for solving problems with rifle fire. "Legal summons," the clerk stammered, practically throwing the official document at Ezra, before hurrying back to his horse. "You're required to appear in territorial court in 2 weeks. Elena read the letter over Ezra's shoulder, her face growing pale as she understood what it meant. Her mother had made good on her threat, filing a legal claim for custody of Miguel, based on blood relationship, and claiming that Elena was an unfit mother living in an immoral arrangement with a man she wasn't married to. "Can they really do this?" Elena asked, bouncing Miguel gently as he fussed in her arms. At 4 months old, he was healthy and happy, with chubby cheeks and bright eyes that still reminded everyone of his father. "They can try," Ezra replied grimly. "Question is whether we let them succeed." Over the past months since her mother's visit, Elena and Ezra had grown closer in ways that went beyond just being parents to the same child. They worked together seamlessly now, sharing the daily tasks of mountain life and finding comfort in each other's company during the long winter nights. But they had never talked about marriage, never discussed making their arrangement official in the eyes of the law. Elena wasn't sure if Ezra saw her as anything more than the mother of his child and a convenient housekeeper. And Ezra wasn't sure if Elena would want to tie herself legally to a rough mountain man when she could probably find someone younger and more civilized in one of the growing towns. "There's one way to make their case a lot weaker," Ezra said carefully, not looking directly at Elena as he spoke. "What's that?" "If we were married, legally married, with proper papers and witnesses, then you wouldn't be living in sin, and Miguel would have a legitimate father on record." Elena's heart started beating faster, but she tried to keep her voice steady. "Is that a proposal?" Ezra finally met her eyes, and she saw vulnerability there that she'd never noticed before. "I guess it is. Not a very romantic one, but practical." "Practical," Elena repeated, trying to decide if she was disappointed or relieved by his matter-of-fact approach. "Like a business arrangement." "Not business," Ezra said quickly. "More like partnership. We've been good partners so far, haven't we? Taking care of each other, raising Miguel together, making this place feel like a real home." Elena looked around the cabin that had become so dear to her over the past year. Every corner held memories now. Miguel's first smile by the fireplace. Quiet evenings when she and Ezra talked about their dreams for the future. Mornings when she woke up and felt genuinely happy to be alive. "What about love?" she asked quietly. The question hung between them like morning mist, delicate and potentially dangerous. They had never spoken of love, though Elena suspected she had been falling into it gradually, like sinking into a warm bath. The way Ezra looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, the gentleness in his hands when he held Miguel, the protective fury she'd seen in his eyes when her mother threatened their family, it all suggested feelings deeper than mere partnership. "I loved my first wife," Ezra said slowly. "Loved her desperately, completely, in the way young people love. But what we have, it's different. Quieter, maybe, but stronger in some ways, built on respect and trust instead of just passion." Elena nodded, understanding what he meant. Her feelings for Ezra had grown slowly but surely, rooted in gratitude at first, but deepening into something much more substantial. She admired his strength and kindness, the way he had given her freedom instead of demanding servitude, the patience he showed when teaching her mountain skills. "And Miguel needs parents who are legally recognized," she said practically, "especially if we're going to fight my mother in court." "Especially then," Ezra agreed. Judges tend to side with traditional families over irregular arrangements. Elena made her decision with the same quiet determination that had helped her survive everything life had thrown at her so far. "Then let's get married. Before the court date, so we can present ourselves as a proper family." The relief in Ezra's eyes told Elena that he had been more worried about her answer than he'd let on. "We'll have to go down to Bitter Creek for the ceremony, find a preacher and some witnesses." "Will people talk?" Elena asked, thinking about the gossip that had already surrounded their unconventional situation. "People always talk," Ezra replied with a slight smile. "Question is whether we care what they say." Elena thought about that as she prepared Miguel's bottle for his afternoon feeding. She had spent most of her life caring desperately about other people's opinions, trying to be the perfect daughter, the obedient girl, the grateful recipient of charity. But living in these mountains with Ezra had taught her that the only opinions that really mattered were those of people who actually cared about her well-being. "No," she said finally. "I don't think I care anymore. As long as we know what we're building here is real and good, that's enough." Over the following days, they made preparations for both the wedding and the legal battle that would follow. Ezra cleaned and pressed his best clothes, while Elena worked on altering one of Martha's dresses to fit her changed figure. It felt strange to wear a dead woman's wedding dress, but somehow also appropriate, like Martha was giving her blessing to this new chapter in Ezra's life. The night before they were scheduled to leave for town, Elena found Ezra sitting on the cabin's front porch, staring up at the stars that shone so much brighter in the mountain darkness than they ever had in the settlements. "Having second thoughts?" she asked, settling beside him with Miguel sleeping peacefully in her arms. "About marrying you? No. About what comes after? Maybe?" Elena waited for him to explain, having learned that Ezra sometimes needed time to find the right words for complicated feelings. "Your mother won't give up easily," he said eventually. "And there are probably other people who think they can profit from our situation. Marrying you means I'm claiming responsibility for both of you, publicly and legally. It makes us a target." "We're already a target," Elena pointed out. "At least this way, we're a legitimate target." Ezra chuckled at her logic. "When did you get so practical?" "I learned from watching you," Elena replied. "You taught me that surviving isn't about avoiding problems. It's about facing them with the right tools and the right people beside you." As they sat together in the mountain silence, watching their breath form clouds in the cold air, Elena felt a deep sense of rightness about the path they were choosing. Tomorrow they would become husband and wife in the eyes of the law, but tonight they were already family in all the ways that truly mattered. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled its lonely song to the moon. But Elena didn't feel lonely anymore. She had found her place in the world, and tomorrow she would make it official with the man who had given her freedom and then chosen to share his life with her anyway. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as partners, as parents, and now as husband and wife. The mountains had taught them both that the strongest foundations were built slowly, stone by stone, through seasons of testing and growth. Their love might not be the desperate passion of fairy tales, but it was something better, a choice made daily, a commitment renewed with each shared sunrise, a promise as enduring as the peaks that surrounded their mountain home.